Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm going to be really brief because I want you to have as much time with Sylvia as possible. I'm going to give you just a few facts about her background. She's very well educated. She has many degrees, including degrees in graphic design. She studied at Emily Carr University. She has an MFA from UBC. She's an educator. She's taught at UBC, at Emily Carr University, Queen's University in Belfast, and she's guest lectured at numerous universities and cultural institutions, actually around the world. She's also a museologist. She's advised museums on the conservation of photography and digital media. And as an artist, she has exhibited a substantial body of work around the world as well. She's had exhibitions in Taiwan, in Ireland, in England, in Scotland, in Italy, Slovenia, and she's had exhibitions across Canada. She has also created large-scale public artworks, including a piece that was completed a couple of years ago for the city of Richmond. She has developed and produced many community-engaged projects here, as well as overseas. And she is also an innovator, and she's received a number of grants and awards, including several awards for art and innovation, both here and in the UK. She is deeply interested and committed to the art of photography, including its history and its technology. She carefully considers both the tools that she uses and her subjects. She has produced work about photography from the perspective of all manner of optical devices, from X-ray equipment to the stereoscopes to the building and using camera obscuras, and more recently, the new field of photography that we experience as Google Streetview. She's always been on the leading edge, as well as keeping a foot in the past, so knowing where we've come from in order to know where we're going in the future. She's a very thoughtful artist, and in some cases, probably extraordinarily thorough in her research and consideration of her subject. Her work doesn't consist of a single photograph of one bus stop, such as the project she did of Surrey. She did every bus stop in Surrey, and that's about 1,000 bus stops. So she's walked just about every street in the city. That's 300 square kilometers, if you want to think about that. She's photographed entire cities, such as East Kilbride. She's also, in Belfast, photographed all the churches, and created really interesting exhibitions to think about them in new ways and in important ways about who we are and where we live and how we build our environment around us. In the process of making her artwork, she is considering not only the past but also the future, and in seeing the world through her photographs, we see ourselves. Please join me in welcoming Sylvia Grace Borda.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. My goodness, full house, brilliant. What I'm going to go through is a bit of the project and why I undertook it. Because when you see sometimes work, it stands alone and there's not necessarily the artist's voice behind it. So the endeavor that has been created for the Surrey Art Gallery is titled "This One's for the Farmer." And even in semantics, it was actually about doing something for the agricultural community, where for the general arts community, it would be coming in as a secondary audience. And in some ways, they would have to kind of work hard to understand why the piece is this one for the farmer, and how kind of there's a hybrid, how there's another way of looking at farming in terms of its sustainability and in terms of it being a subject for contemporary art. So why farming? Well, part of it is that historically there is a very sort of 19th century treatment. Camille Corot and many other sort of romantic painters addressed farming. But really, from that period in the 1800s up until present, there hasn't really been a readdress of agri practices or even the people behind them. So I wanted to actually kind of look at creating a contemporary portrait for Surrey and for the Fraser Valley. And the one thing I thought that is kind of an absence is the fact that farming's present, but it's something that we typically drive by, and it's not something that we actually have privileged access to. So there's a bit of a disconnect. And I wanted to kind of examine how farming could be portrayed as a subject that would be really valuable in terms of both the agri-practice as well as the arts community. But in fact, as I'm saying that there's this kind of disconnect to looking at landscape and to farming, there is something that's really interesting beyond this romantic notion that farming was running historically A-OK, which is artists like Vincent van Gogh actually went through Arles, and people don't actually recognize that we have kind of a historical archive or repertoire of farming art, but in fact it was actually speaking about tension and a certain kind of evolution of a city. And so what you see in this image by Arles, by Vincent van Gogh in Arles, is that yes, wheat was being certainly harvested, and at this point by hand, by scythe, but equally in the distance was the smokestacks and the emerging city. And in some ways, I always actually argue that Surrey is my Paris of the North. In fact, Surrey has a lot in common, probably more so with France than it realizes if you look at it in terms of its historical footprint. Cities grow, they change, and as they evolve, different tensions start to arise as do different sort of viewpoints. So I was really interested in this idea that even in a longer term of history, there are other viewpoints that maybe we're just not familiar with, and it's really interesting to equally look at them. This said, you can also see that smokestack back there in Vincent van Gogh's Orchard in Blossom sequence that he did. And in some ways, this is very true to Surrey. What you actually find is you find that agricultural parceled land has become fragmented. It's no longer sitting in kind of easy parcels. It's hard to know where to necessarily find farms. There's certain corridors. But for smaller farmers, they're becoming a little bit more isolated and packaged in very different ways. So I wanted to bring forward that actually artists have always been sort of at that cutting edge. They've always actually looked at agri-practices and brought it to the foreground. It's whether we read them in a contemporary time frame as valuable and we see that kind of underlying message attached to them. Equally, probably everyone knows Vincent van Gogh's sunflowers. It's seen as a very sort of lovely pictorial image, but in its time it was exceptionally revolutionary because what it was yes, a sequence of 4 canvases painted of various sunflowers, but sunflowers were considered the lowest cash crop in France. They were basically harvested to make oil, sunflower oil, for sausages. This was actually a very corrosive image to see as a viewer. If you were living in this time frame, you would have actually thought that this was an exceptionally revolutionary image. So in some ways, images actually transcend very differently, and yet they still have a social history attached to them. It's how we read into them. So I was equally interested in this idea that cities kind of evolve and change, and as Leanne mentioned, I've always got an interest in how photography is interrelated in that process. And you have a well-known photographer, Eugene Auger, who is well-known for photographing Paris. He also photographed its sort of fringe areas, which included Montmartre. And Montmartre was actually a farming district. Most people don't realize that. They think of the Moulin Rouge. But it was, in fact, the city encroached on it. As it expanded, it started to break into green belts. And very interestingly, farmers got very enterprising. They started to realize that as the city grew, the city actually had a bit of a seedy side, and why not convert the farms and the barns to brothels? So that was their new cash crop. And they did very well. We still have the Moulin Rouge running today. So in some ways, farming and the city have kind of always run in tandem. It's just whether we know about those histories in some way. So Eugene Auger actually did a whole series looking at Montmartre as it sort of changed and shifted. He also did apple trees and orchards, which are his lesser-known work. He's much more known for the direct sort of city portraits that he did in Paris.